My name isn't in there, is it? The question slipped out before I could stop it. The room smelled like lemon oil and raincoats, Portland's Old Port in March, fog pressing against the window panes of Linden and Quayle, attorneys at law. Mr. Linden adjusted his oar-shaped cufflinks and glanced at the glossy pages one more time, as if my name might appear if he read it kindly enough. It is not, he said, voice careful. Per the amended will, the estate transfers to the Halvorson Family Trust with Mr. Halvorson as sole trustee. 40 years of marriage distilled to a sentence with no place for me. I folded my hands in my lap to hide the tremor. Charles didn't look at me. He worried a speck of lint from his jacket sleeve the way he does when he's sure he's right. It's for your protection, Evie, he said, using the nickname that always sounds like a pat on the head. You've never liked the money side of things. I remembered the winter of '98 when the money side of things meant I drove night shifts at the rehab center and sold my grandmother's silver to cover payroll for the boat rentals. Protection? I swallowed that memory and chose a different one. Grace at 5, asleep on my shoulder after her first day of kindergarten, the scent of chalk dust and apple shampoo in her hair. Family is a long ledger of what we hold for each other. Mr. Linden cleared his throat. There are, however, provisions for a monthly stipend. A stipend, I repeated, tasting the word like a lemon seed. How generous. Charles finally met my eyes and I saw it then. Not malice, not even triumph. Something worse. The ease of a man who believes he's fixing a problem that only he can see. Evie, you'll be comfortable. I'll make sure. I set my purse on the polished table and smoothed the flap. 63 doesn't make you invisible, no matter how softly people start speaking around you. Charles, I said, why the rush to change what we agreed on last summer? He shrugged. We needed a cleaner structure. Texas. You wouldn't understand the details. I've understood the details since 1985, I said softly. I just don't always announce it. A gull shrieked outside. Somewhere down on Commercial Street a truck backfired, and Mr. Linden flinched like the air itself had objected. He slid the binder toward Charles with a new signature tab. I stood. Are we done here? For today, Mr. Linden said. Mrs. Halvorson. Ms., I corrected. Evelyn Hart Halvorson. Outside, the fog wrapped the sidewalks like damp muslin. I walked 3 blocks without feeling my feet, past brick warehouses turned galleries, past the bakery where Grace used to beg for maple-glazed donuts after church. The bells at St. Bridget's told the half-hour, and for a moment I saw myself from above. A woman in a pale blue raincoat, small against the weather, not small at all inside. At the corner, I pulled my phone from my pocket. There was a text from Grace. A photo of the harbor at twilight captioned, "You all done? Call me." Another from my neighbor Maeve, "Scones cooling. Tea if you need it." Underneath those, a name I had put in favorites years ago and never needed until now. I typed only 4 words. Harry, it's time. I didn't feel angry. Not yet. Anger is loud and fleeting. What I felt was colder, cleaner. The clarity of someone who's kept every receipt, every tax return, every handwritten note on the dry erase board by the back door. Evie covered mortgage this month. 40 years is a long time to be underestimated. You learn how to keep house with paper. Behind me, a door opened and closed. I caught Charles's reflection in a shop window, then only fog. He thought the new will had settled everything, tucked me into a safe little corner of his careful plans. He had no idea he'd just started the part of our story where I step into the center of the page. The first page of my life with Charles was written in 1983, on a dock that smelled of salt and diesel. I was 23, fresh out of nursing school, working double shifts at Mercy General, when a friend dragged me to the Stonemere Harbor Festival. He was there, sleeves rolled to the elbow, coaxing a battered outboard motor back to life. He looked up, grinned like he'd been expecting me and said, "You look like you could handle a storm." I didn't know then how many storms we'd weather together, or that some of them would have his name on the clouds. We married the following summer. No money for a big reception, just a potluck at Maeve's family barn and a borrowed string quartet playing under twinkle lights. We rented a 1-bedroom above a hardware store and saved for our first boat. He called it the Evelyn Grace after me and later our daughter. The early years were lean, but we were resourceful. I picked up extra shifts at the hospital. He ferried tourists around the bay, told them the legends about the lighthouse that had no light. We kept the books together at the kitchen table. Me with my neat columns and pencil, him with a coffee cup balanced dangerously close to the receipts. I never thought of those years as sacrifice. They were building years. When the economy dipped in '91, I sold my grandmother's quilt collection to keep the business afloat. In '98, when Charles threw out his back hauling an engine, I ran the rentals alone for 6 months, mending lines, scraping barnacles, smiling at customers while my hands blistered. Charles liked to say, "Evie keeps us steady." I wore that like a badge, not realizing that in his mind, steady meant silent. As the decades rolled on, the house grew bigger, the boats newer, and the paperwork more complicated. We hired an accountant, then a financial planner, and eventually a lawyer to streamline the structure. I trusted him with the details, trusted that our meant both of us. But I also kept my own records. Not because I didn't believe him, but because I was my father's daughter. He'd lost the family farm in a dispute he could have won if he'd kept better documents. I promised myself I'd never be caught without proof. So in a dented filing cabinet in the laundry room, behind an old flannel blanket, I stored every tax return, every business license, every scrap of paper where Charles had acknowledged my role. Over 40 years, that drawer became its own kind of diary, the quiet story of my half of everything. And now, sitting in Maeve's kitchen with a cup of her strong Irish breakfast tea, I realized that drawer might be the only voice I had left in this marriage. Maeve slid a plate of scones toward me. "He's made a mistake," she said. "The question is whether you're going to let him think it's permanent." I broke the scone in half, steam curling into the air. "Oh, it's permanent all right," I said. "Just not in the way he expects." Harriet Cole's office sat in an old brick building on Exchange Street, the kind with wrought iron balconies and creaky wooden floors that whispered about every client who'd walked there before you. The brass plaque on her door didn't brag, just H. Cole, attorney at law. But inside, the walls were lined with framed case victories and black and white photographs of women standing their ground. She didn't waste time on small talk. "Tell me what happened, Evie." I told her. About the amended will. About the stipend that was supposed to be my consolation prize. About the 40 years of marriage that apparently translated to zero legal standing in Charles's cleaner structure. Harriet listened without interrupting, her pen scratching only when I mentioned the filing cabinet. "You have all those documents here in town?" I nodded. Every tax return, every receipt, every note where he admits I covered expenses. "That's not just sentiment," she said. "That's evidence." She leaned back, studying me. "You're not after revenge, are you?" "No," I shook my head. "I'm after recognition. And protection, for me, for Grace. I don't want her to inherit a fight." Harriet smiled faintly. "Then we start by finding the cracks." She pulled a legal pad closer. "First, the boat rental business. How is it registered?" "In my name," I said. "Always has been. 1987. Her brows lifted. "That's significant. If it's producing income, it's a separate asset, and without your consent, it doesn't go into that trust." For the first time since the will reading, I felt something other than cold clarity. I felt leverage. We went through every piece of property, every account, every policy. Harriet marked things in green if they were indisputably mine, yellow if there was room for argument, red if Charles had locked them under his name years ago. By the end, there were far more green marks than I expected. When we finished, she closed her notebook. "You're in a stronger position than you think. But we need to move carefully. Let him believe you're stunned, quiet, while we line up the facts. If he thinks you're coming for him now, he'll dig in." I thought about Charles's face in the law office, how sure he'd been that this was just another thing I'd quietly accept. "I can do quiet," I said. "For now." Harriet leaned forward. "Then Evie, this is where the tide starts turning." 3 days later, I was down at the harbor to return a set of life jackets Maeve had borrowed for her nephews. The air was sharp with salt and early spring chill, the gulls loud enough to drown out most conversations. But not the one I overheard. 2 slips over. Henry Bowers, who's been fixing boat engines in Stonemere longer than I've been married, was talking to a younger man in a tailored overcoat. The coat didn't match the setting, neither did the polished leather shoes. "Moving assets into the trust before summer," the man was saying. "We just need to clear the paperwork." Henry scratched his chin. "And Evie's okay with that?" The man's smile was thin. "It's all under Mr. Halvorson's authority now." He noticed me then, his eyes flicking to the bundle of life jackets in my arms. He gave a polite nod, the kind strangers give when they're deciding whether you're worth remembering. By the time I reached the truck, my hands had gone cold around the nylon straps. If Charles was already moving assets, then Harriet's quiet phase was on borrowed time. That night I called Grace. She answered on the second ring, wind in the background. "Hey Mom. Everything okay?" "I saw someone down at the harbor talking to Henry about the trust," I said. "A man in a city coat." There was a pause, just long enough to tell me she knew exactly who I meant. "Dad's been meeting with a financial consultant. Says he's streamlining things." I let out a breath. "And he told you this because?" "Because I asked why he was in Portland so much lately. He said it was all for the family." The word family landed between us like a stone dropped in still water. "Grace," I said carefully, "if he asks you to sign anything—" "I won't," she said quickly. "I'm not 12 anymore." When we hung up, I pulled out the old flannel blanket in the laundry room and unlocked the filing cabinet. The scent of paper and faint cedar greeted me. I ran my hand over the labeled folders. Taxes 85 to 04, boat licenses, insurance claims, mortgage paid 1998. Harriet wanted quiet, but she'd also said to be ready. I stacked the folders in my tote bag until the weight pulled at my shoulder. Then I zipped it shut, set it by the front door and turned off the light. If Charles wanted to move quickly, I could move faster. By the time I stepped into Harriet's office the next morning, the tote bag was cutting into my shoulder. I set it on her desk, the zipper gaping just enough to reveal the neatly labeled folders inside. She raised an eyebrow. "You brought me treasure." "Treasure," I said, "and insurance." We went through each folder, page by page. Harriet's pen danced across legal pads, jotting case references, dates and potential leverage points. Every so often she'd pause and smile, the kind of smile you give when the current's suddenly flowing your way. "You have 40 years of documented contributions," she said. "Not just memories, hard evidence. Judges like evidence." I thought about Charles's face when he told me I wouldn't understand the details. He's always been sure I never paid attention. "That," Harriet said, "is the first advantage we're going to use." She suggested a plan in careful strokes. We'd file a temporary injunction on the boat rental business to prevent any transfer. Quietly request a full accounting of the trust's current assets. And send a formal letter reminding Charles's attorneys that certain properties and accounts were acquired through joint effort, regardless of whose name was on the deed. "He'll see it as a warning shot," I said. Harriet leaned back. "Good. It might make him hesitate before moving anything else." The late morning light poured through her window, catching on the brass scale of justice that sat on the shelf. For the first time, it didn't feel like a distant symbol. It felt like something I might actually tip in my favor. As I left her office, I passed a young couple in the waiting room, their hands clenched together, eyes full of worry. I knew that look. I'd worn it just days ago. Outside, the harbor wind snapped at my raincoat. The tide was coming in, lifting the boats in their slips. Some moved easily, others strained against their lines. I understood both. Charles thought this was a storm he could chart alone. He had no idea I'd already started setting my own nets. 2 nights later, Charles called just as I was closing the curtains. His voice was smooth, practiced, the one he used on customers and local reporters. "Evie thought we could have dinner tomorrow. Just the 2 of us." I almost laughed. We hadn't had just the 2 of us in months, unless you counted sitting across from each other at the kitchen island in silence. "Sure," I said, keeping my tone light. "Where?" "The shoreline." 7 o'clock. The shoreline was the kind of place where the waiters knew your drink order before you sat down, and the oysters were flown in daily. Charles reserved tables there for 2 reasons: to celebrate or to control the conversation. When I arrived, the maitre d' ushered me to a corner table with a view of the harbor. Charles was already seated, a glass of bourbon sweating on the linen. He stood to pull out my chair, a gesture from another decade, and smiled like nothing in the world was wrong. We ordered. We talked about Grace's new project at work, the weather, the fishing forecast. Only after the plates were cleared did he lean back and lace his fingers over his stomach. "I think this business with Harriet is a misunderstanding," he said. "You're upset about the will, I get that. But we can sort it out without making things messy." "Messy?" I echoed. You know how these things look to the community. People talk. And it's not good for Grace to have her parents at odds. I let him speak, nodding at intervals as if I were considering every word. What I was really considering was how Harriet had been right. He still thought I was playing catch-up. When he paused, I leaned forward. Charles, if this is about community, then let's be honest about what we've built together. 40 years. The boats. The house. The business. He waved a hand. Of course. But the trust is the safest way too. Safest for whom? I asked softly. For the first time that evening, he didn't have an immediate answer. The check arrived. He signed it quickly, eager to end the moment, and walked me to my car. As I unlocked the door, he said, "Let's keep the lawyers out of this, Evie. We can work it out ourselves." I smiled, sliding into the driver's seat. We'll see. Driving home, I realized that dinner hadn't been about reconciliation. It had been reconnaissance. Charles was gauging my resolve. And now he knew I had it. The next morning, I stopped by Maeve's bakery for coffee. The smell of warm bread wrapped around me like a blanket, but the look on Maeve's face was sharp. "Heard something down at the docks," she said, sliding a mug toward me. "Your name's missing from more than the will." I set the mug down. "Go on." "Word is Charles is in talks to sell 2 of the larger boats to a couple from Boston. Quiet sale, cash heavy." The steam from the coffee curled between us, and I felt that same cold clarity from the day in Lyndon's office. If that's true, he's moving faster than Harriet thought. Maeve shrugged. "Men in a hurry tend to leave footprints. This one's stomping." I left the bakery with a cinnamon bun I didn't taste and drove straight to the harbor. The slips were half empty, the tide pulling low. Henry Bowers was bent over an engine, the brim of his cap shading his eyes. "Henry," I called, "you seen the Morning Star lately?" He straightened slowly, wiping his hands on a rag. "Loaded onto a trailer 2 nights ago. Headed south. Didn't think it was my place to mention." I thanked him and walked the length of the dock, my shoes echoing on the planks. Each empty slip felt like a missing tooth in a smile that had once been ours. By the time I reached my truck, I'd already pulled out my phone. Harriet answered on the first ring. "He's started liquidating," I said. There was a pause, then the sound of her chair rolling back. "That changes the timeline. We'll file for an emergency injunction this afternoon." The harbor wind whipped my hair into my face, but I didn't push it back. I just stood there watching gulls dive and rise again, their cries sharp against the water. Charles thought he was trimming the sails before a storm. He didn't realize the tide had already turned against him. Harriet's office smelled faintly of ink and the strong peppermint tea she favored when things got serious. By the time I arrived, her desk was covered in papers, each with a yellow tab jutting out like warning flags. "We're moving on 2 fronts," she said without looking up. "First, the emergency injunction to freeze any sale or transfer of the boats and business assets. Second, a formal demand for a complete inventory of the trust's holdings as of last month, before he started making changes." She slid a document across the desk. "This is your affidavit. Read it carefully before signing." The pages were dense with legal language, but my story was there between the lines. 40 years of work, joint earnings, documented contributions. Proof I wasn't just along for the ride. When I finished reading, I signed in the wide, looping hand my father taught me, the one he used when signing the deed to the farm before it was taken. Harriet gathered the papers into a neat stack. "Once this is filed, Charles will know you're not bluffing. He'll have to respond within 72 hours. I thought about the dinner at the shoreline, his calm assurances, the way he tried to draw me back into the role of silent partner. "Good," I said. "Let him know I'm not." We walked together to the courthouse 2 blocks away, the wind funneling through the narrow streets. Inside, the clerk stamped the documents with a sound like a gavel striking wood. "That's it," Harriet said. "The freeze is in place." As we stepped back onto the street, my phone buzzed. A message from Grace. "Dad's in a mood. He just got a call from his lawyer. Did you do something?" I typed back. "Just securing what's ours." For the first time in weeks, I felt lighter. Not because the fight was over, but because I'd finally stepped fully into it. Charles could tell himself whatever story he wanted about control and protection. I had just written the first chapter of a very different ending. It was Grace's idea. Both of you. 1 table. No lawyers. Just talk, she said over the phone, her voice careful like she was setting down china on a shaky shelf. I agreed, knowing Charles would too, not because he wanted resolution, but because he thought he could still manage the narrative if Grace was in the room. We met at her apartment above the bookshop on 4th Street. The smell of fresh paint and cinnamon from the bakery downstairs lingered in the air. Grace had set out 3 mugs of coffee and a plate of shortbread, as if sugar could soften the edges. Charles arrived in a pressed navy blazer, the same one he wore to Rotary meetings. "Evie," he said with a polite nod as though we were acquaintances, not spouses of 4 decades. Grace sat between us, hands wrapped around her mug. "I just want to understand what's happening." Charles leaned forward, clasping his hands. "What's happening is your mother is overreacting to a legal adjustment that's meant to keep our assets secure." I met Grace's eyes. "What's happening is your father removed me from the trust without discussion, began selling assets we built together, and expected me to accept a monthly allowance like a child." Charles's jaw tightened. "It's not an allowance. It's a safeguard." "A safeguard against what?" "My judgment. My existence." I kept my tone even, but Grace's gaze flicked between us, reading the unspoken words. She set her mug down. "Dad, I've seen Mom's records. All of them. The tax returns, the receipts, the notes you wrote when she kept the business going while you were in surgery." Charles blinked, caught off guard. "You went through." "She showed me," Grace said. "Because I asked. And now I know what 40 years looks like on paper. It's not just your name on that work." The room was quiet except for the muffled hum of traffic outside. I watched Charles absorb the fact that Grace, his audience, his legacy, had seen the full ledger. He stood, smoothing his blazer. "I think we're done here." "No," Grace said, her voice firm. "We're just getting started." As he left, the scent of his cologne trailed behind, sharp and fleeting. Grace reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "Don't stop now, Mom." I smiled. I wasn't planning to. 2 days after the meeting at Grace's, Harriet called just after sunrise. "He's reached out," she said. "Through his lawyer. Wants to resolve matters privately." I sat at the kitchen table, the light just beginning to spill across the harbor outside my window. "What's his definition of resolve?" "They're offering to add you back into the trust as a co-beneficiary, not co-trustee. No control over decisions. And they want you to drop the injunction." I laughed. A short, sharp sound that startled the gulls outside. "So I get to watch him sell everything as long as my name's on the paperwork?" "Exactly," Harriet said. "It's a bone, not a settlement." I thought about the morning star disappearing in the night, about the ledger in my filing cabinet, about Grace's steady gaze across the coffee table. "No," I said. "We're past bones." Harriet's tone warmed. "Then I'll tell them we require full reinstatement as co-trustee, acknowledgement of your contributions, and a halt to all asset transfers until a new agreement is signed." "They'll say no," I said. "Probably," she admitted. "But every time they refuse, it strengthens our case." By the time I hung up, the sun had cleared the rooftops. The harbor was awake, fishermen calling across the docks, the slap of water against hulls. Charles had made his opening move. I was already planning the next 3. It was Maeve who told me first. I'd stopped by her bakery for a loaf of rye, and she leaned across the counter like she was passing me contraband. "He's been talking too much," she whispered. I raised an eyebrow. "Charles." She nodded. "At O'Malley's last night, bragging about how the boats will be gone by summer and the money out of reach. Said you wouldn't see a dime if he could help it." The words settled over me like cold fog. "Who heard him?" "Half the back room," Maeve said. "Including Terry Lynch. And you know Terry, he'd testify about the color of your socks if you asked him." I left the bakery with the bread under my arm and a plan already forming. Harriet had told me once that arrogance leaves a trail. This one was practically paved. That afternoon I called Terry. He didn't hesitate. I heard every word. Even said the new will was just step 1. I met him at the Harbor Cafe, bought him a coffee and let him talk. By the end I had a full page of notes in my tidy script. Dates, times, exact phrases. Terry even offered to swear to it in court. When I gave the notes to Harriet, she tapped her pen against the paper. "This isn't just useful, it's gold. It shows intent, that he's deliberately trying to cut you out, not just reorganizing for taxes." I thought about Charles in that navy blazer telling Grace and me it was all for the family. Let's use it, I said. Harriet smiled. Oh, we will. By the following week, the air between Charles and me had shifted from cold to electric. Every glance, every silence, sparking with the knowledge that the next move would be public. Harriet filed the supplemental affidavit with Terry's statement attached. She sent me a copy. The bold black letters on the court header looked heavier than paper should be. This, she told me, will get the judge's attention. It shows motive. And motive changes everything. That night Grace called. Dad's furious, she said without preamble. He thinks you're trying to humiliate him. I'm trying to protect what we built, I said. She was quiet for a moment. I know. But he's not going to back down. I stared out the kitchen window at the dark line of the horizon. Neither am I. The next day Charles made his counter-move, a formal request through his lawyer for mediation. Harriet explained it was a tactic, to look cooperative in front of the court while still pressing his advantage. Do we agree to it? I asked. Yes, she said. But on our terms. Full financial disclosure before we step into that room. And no dropping the injunction. 2 days later the disclosure packet arrived. I spread the pages across my dining table. Columns of numbers, property lists, account statements. As I went through them, one detail stopped me cold. A wire transfer to an account in another state, dated the week after the will reading. I circled it in red and called Harriet. She didn't even try to hide the satisfaction in her voice. That, Evie, is the kind of thing judges love to see, because it means someone's been moving money in anticipation of a fight. I looked down at the neat circle I'd drawn. It wasn't just numbers. It was proof. And proof was something I had in spades. The mediation was set for a Thursday in a neutral office downtown. Neutral in name only because the glass-walled conference room still smelled faintly of the last corporate lunch that had been catered there. Harriet and I arrived early, taking seats at one end of the polished table. She spread out our folders like a general laying maps before a campaign. Charles walked in with his lawyer 5 minutes later. He didn't look at me, just set his leather briefcase on the table and took the chair opposite. Grace wasn't there. I'd asked her to stay out of this part. The mediator, a silver-haired woman named Lorraine, started with pleasantries and ground rules. Then she invited Charles's side to speak first. His lawyer leaned forward. Our position remains that the trust structure is the best way to preserve the estate. We're willing to include Mrs. Halvorson as a co-beneficiary, but not as a trustee. Harriet didn't flinch. Our position is that Mrs. Halvorson be reinstated as co-trustee, with full authority over decisions, recognition of her documented contributions, and the injunction to remain in place until those terms are met. Lorraine looked at Charles. Is there any flexibility here? He glanced at me for the first time all morning, his expression tight. Evie, you know I'm trying to keep things civil. Civil would have been talking to me before changing the will, I said evenly. Harriet slid a copy of Terry's statement across the table. And civil would not involve publicly boasting about cutting my client out. The room went still. Charles's lawyer picked up the page, scanned it, and his mouth tightened. We weren't aware of this. I'm sure you weren't, Harriet said, her voice calm but edged. Lorraine cleared her throat. Perhaps we should take a break. During the pause, Harriet and I stepped into the hallway. He's rattled, she said quietly. That's good. It means he's starting to understand he can't control the narrative here. When we returned, Charles's tone was different. Not conciliatory but less certain. He suggested considering joint oversight of the business. It wasn't enough, but it was movement. As we wrapped for the day, Lorraine scheduled another session for the following week. Charles left without a word. I watched him go, knowing the next time we sat at that table, I'd have even more leverage. Because Harriet and I weren't done digging. The following Tuesday, Harriet called with the kind of energy in her voice that meant she'd found something. Evie, you remember that wire transfer you spotted in the disclosure packet? Of course. It leads to a holding account connected to a limited liability company in Vermont. And guess who's listed as the sole managing member? I didn't have to guess. Charles. Exactly. And here's the best part. The LLC was registered 2 days after the will amendment. That makes it look like he's moving marital assets into a separate shell. I felt the air shift around me the way it does before a storm breaks. That's not just suspicious. That's intent. Right, Harriet said. And if we present this at the next mediation with the supporting bank records, it's going to force him into a corner. The rest of the week I could feel Charles circling. A voicemail saying we should find a way back to trust. An email with a photo of Grace as a child, no message attached. Little gestures designed to remind me of history, of sentiment, the things he thought would make me step back. But history isn't erased by memory. It's written in deeds, in signatures, in 40 years of shared work. And I had the receipts. The next mediation was set for Friday. Harriet and I would walk in with the LLC documents, the wire transfer proof, Terry's sworn statement, and my decades of records. It would be the full ledger of our life together, and the undeniable evidence of how he'd tried to rewrite it. That night I stood on the back deck watching the harbor lights ripple across the dark water. For the first time since this began, I felt something close to peace. Not because the fight was over, but because I could see the shape of its ending. And it was one where I stood in full daylight, my name exactly where it belonged.